Hi friends, it's Laura. Today I'm going to be filming a video that I've wanted to film and thought about filming for quite some time, and that is my top 10 favorite series of all time. Also, just a quick note, I apologize for my voice. I'm currently getting over a cold, so I know I sound really weird. I apologize for that. This was an incredibly difficult list to put together. I didn't realize it would be so difficult, but it was. So I kind of set some parameters for myself. First of all, I only included one series per author. There's a couple authors on this list that have written multiple series that I've read and enjoyed and would have been on my top 10 list, but I only kept it down to one series per author. The other thing is that I only wanted to include completed series, which makes sense. You can't really call a series your favorite if you haven't finished it yet or if it hasn't been completed. But because I'm a walking contradiction, the number one series on this list is a series that is not finished yet, but I know that in my heart, in my soul, it is going to be, and already is, my favorite series of all time. And another thing is I only wanted to include series that I had some distance from. So like I have an honorable mention, which is a series that I finished this year, but I don't feel like I can call it an all-time favorite because I only just finished it. So those were the rules that I set for myself. So let's just get into it. These are not particularly ranked from 10 to 1. I am gonna save my number one series for last. I'm more so going in order of kind of when I read them. Sort of. So let's start off with my honorable mention, which is the David Bad Trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty, starting with The City of Brass. I adored this series so much, but I only just finished the last book last month, so I don't have enough distance from it to know whether this has that staying power, whether this is truly going to be a lasting favorite series of all time for me. So I'm only having it as an honorable mention, but I adored this. I love these characters. I love Nahri and I love Prince Ali and Dariyavahush. I love saying his name. I love the magic in here. I love the mythology. I love the world building. I love S.A. Chakraborty's writing so much. And I couldn't not mention this when talking about my favorite series of all time, but because I don't have the distance from it yet, I can't really say for sure that this is going to forever remain in my top 10. Okay, starting with the oldest series on my list, we have to talk about The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. I have a very interesting history with this series, with this book in particular. I actually received an ARC of The Hunger Games, and I remember picking it up and reading it and being utterly disgusted by the fact that these kids had to fight each other to the death. Up until this point, I had never read dystopian fiction. I was someone that always read happy and uplifting type books. I never experienced this type of violence before in my fiction, and so this just like disgusted me. And I remember reading about maybe like a third of it and putting it down, and then I decided, you know what, I'm gonna go ahead and finish this book, and I did. I picked it back up, I finished reading it, and I fell in love with Katniss. I fell in love with the themes in here. I think we all pretty much know what The Hunger Games is at this point, so I'm not going to get into the synopsis. I finished this and I screamed from the rooftops about this book, and anyone who came into the bookstore, so I was working at a bookstore back then, I made sure to put this book in their hand. Hunger Games came out in what, 2008? So it's the oldest series on this list. It is the one that has mostly stood the test of time, the one that I continue to think about, the one that has still stuck with me all these years later. And I think that this is probably a series like that for a lot of people. I feel like this was a very formative book and series in my time of reading. This was when I was just getting back into reading, really. When the dystopian era came out, I was at my full peak reading life, and this is what started it all. So I couldn't not put this on the list. I haven't reread it in years. I'm kind of afraid to, but I think I might at some point reread this. I couldn't talk about my favorite series of all time without talking about the Shadowhunter Chronicles as a whole by Cassandra Clare. I cannot decide whether my favorite series so far is The Dark Artifices or the Infernal Devices. So I have both of these here. Honestly, if I was like forced to pick one, I think I would have to go with the Dark Artifices. Even though this has one of my favorite characters of all time, Will Herondale, and one of my favorite love triangles I have ever read, I still think I loved this more. The reading experience of it I enjoyed more. I remember reading this back in 2016 when it came out, when I was pregnant with my daughter. And after reading this, I wanted to name my daughter Annabelle Lee because if you don't know, the Shadowhunter world, it follows half angel, half human people who are tasked with protecting the world from demons. While you could argue that every single Shadowhunter book and series has the exact same plot, this one was a direct retelling of the poem Annabelle Lee by Edgar Allan Poe. You guys know how I feel about Edgar Allan Poe, so I think that also contributed to my love of this series. The Shadowhunters as a whole is the second oldest series on this list, even though I believe City of Bones came out before The Hunger Games, but I didn't read it until after, I think. I can't remember, it was so long ago. But anyway, this is where I placed it in the list. I adore Cassandra Clare's character work. I think that that is the thing she does the best. The relationship between characters, whether that be romantic or familial or just friendship, is so incredibly strong and powerful, and you can feel the bonds of those relationships on the page. Her characters feel like real people. Drama that goes on between characters is definitely something that is so incredibly entertaining, and I think is the one thing that keeps me reading Shadowhunter books to this day. I will never get tired of reading books in the Shadowhunter Chronicles because of the characters, their dynamics, and the way that Cassandra Clare writes them. I think the plot in here is definitely the strongest out of all of them, out of all of the series, besides the original Mortal Instruments. And I just think about this so often. I think about it so often. I think about the reading experience so often because it was such an incredibly immersive reading experience for this particular series. One of my absolute favorites, and I hope will continue to remain so. Next, we're going to talk about An Ember in the Ashes series by Sabaa Tahir. This is just one of my favorite things ever. Very similarly to The Hunger Games, I have a very nostalgic, romanticized relationship with this particular series because at the time that this came out back in 2015, up until that point, I was reading almost exclusively YA fantasy, YA fiction. I had not ventured into the adult fiction, adult fantasy space, and because of that, especially at the particular age I was getting a little bit tired of the genre, of seeing the same things over and over and over again. And when this came out, this completely changed the game for me when it came to YA fantasy. I felt like Sabaa Tahir was writing in a way that I had not seen done before in the YA space. This was brutal, this was mature, this was incredibly well written and developed, and a fantasy on such a more epic scale than I was currently used to at the time. This is another book that I received an ARC for, and after I read it, could not shut up about this book for months and months and months. Tried to get it into everyone's hands because I thought it was just so unique and doing things so differently. If you don't know about this, it takes place in this Roman-inspired empire. It's called the Martial Empire. They have completely colonized the scholar people. We are following Laia, who is a scholar, and she is trying to keep her head down and live under this very brutal rule. However, one night everything changes for her. Her brother is arrested on suspicions of being a spy for the rebellion. Her grandparents are killed, and she is left completely adrift with no one and nowhere to go. And so she decides to go to these rebels and ask them for help in getting her brother out of prison. They agree to help her only on the condition that she becomes a spy for the rebellion in the most dangerous of households, spying the most powerful and dangerous person in the empire. We also follow Elias, who is part of this martial empire. He is currently training to become one of the most elite, feared, brutal soldiers, but he is fed up with the Empire and what they have done to the people around them, and so he is planning to desert. But Laia and Elias's paths cross and things happen. And from there, it is an absolutely wild roller coaster of a ride with new magic, with old magic, with threats from the past reawakening, and the most beautiful mythology woven in. It's one of my favorite series of all time and will continue to be, even though I feel like this style of YA fantasy is something we see a lot, or have seen a lot more of, something that I know I have grown out of since I read this first book, but it will still always hold a special place in my heart because it just completely changed my view on fantasy, and I absolutely adore it for that. Next, we have the Six of Crows duology by Leigh Bardugo, or at least it's currently a duology. Shadow and Bone still remains the Grishaverse, I should say, still remains one of my favorite series of all time, but comparing it to Six of Crows, I definitely enjoyed Six of Crows better. I feel like this is another book that needs absolutely no introduction. Everyone knows about these characters, everyone loves them, especially with the recent success of the Shadow and Bone TV show. I feel like everyone who up to that point had not read this series has now read it. These characters feel so real. I care about them so much, especially Inej and Kaz. Really all of them. I don't have a particular favorite, just all of them are my favorites. This was a completely transformative and immersive experience. Once again, reading this book, it's one that I, to this day, I continue to think about. I continue to relive scenes, specific scenes, in my head over and over again, and I am still holding out hope for that third Six of Crows book. I don't know if it's still gonna be a thing, but I really want it to be because I think it could be incredible. But yeah, I adore this series. I couldn't not put it on the list. These characters just mean everything to me. The Diviner series by Lippa Bray, this is the first book, is a paranormal YA series that takes place in New York in the 1920s. This is the series that introduced me to the 20s as a setting in fiction, and I fell in love with it ever since. I have always enjoyed reading books set in the 20s, even though I'm not a historical reader. I do not like historical settings and time periods, but when it comes to the 1920s, I love them, and I think it's all thanks to this book series. This is one of the most eerie, creepy, scary, atmospheric series that I have read to this day. I think about scenes, especially from the second book, Layer of Dreams, that still give me chills and make me scared. I feel like Lippa Bray is such a socially aware writer as well. I love her ideas. I love her point of view. I love these characters and their interactions and their relationships. I love the magic in here. I love thematically what this series is about and what it does. I had the best time with this series, and I will say, unfortunately, that the series ultimately didn't end in the way I would have loved. The last book in the series wasn't my favorite, but besides that, the series is everything to me, and I constantly think about it. I constantly will continue to, and it is one that has stuck with me over the years. We have We Hunt the Flame by Hafsa Faizal. This is the Sands of Arawiya duology. This is a ancient Arabian inspired YA fantasy that follows our main character Saphira, who is a hunter who has to disguise herself as a man in order to provide for her village, for her family. She's living in a cursed land that is cursed, be in perpetual winter, even though her homeland is supposed to be a desert city. She gets the opportunity to go on this quest to bring magic back and break the curse, and she takes it, and she meets up with Nazir, who has been called the Prince of Death, and things go from there. I adore this series so much. I have not stopped talking about it, honestly, since I've read it. This is one of my favorite settings for fantasy, Arabian inspired desert settings. I have come to learn is some of my absolute favorites, and I love the characters in here. I love Saphira. I love her strength. I love the magic in here. It's so, I was gonna say subtle, but not exactly subtle, but we get the magic in bits and pieces. We get hints of other creatures and other things that just work so well. I love so much. Some of my favorite magical situations and creatures and mythologies are in this book, and I loved it to pieces for that. I love the relationship that blossoms in here between Zafira and Nazir. I think it is so swoon-worthy. I think it is so beautiful, and I absolutely love a broody hero, which we get in here with Nazir. I loved absolutely everything about this, and while this is a newer series for me, I only finished the second book in the duology last year. I know that this is going to have lasting staying power for me because it's one that I cannot stop thinking about. It's one that I definitely want to reread, and soon. So it had to be on the list, and it's definitely near the top. Then we have the Shades of Magic series by V.E. Schwab. You guys know V.E. Schwab is one of my favorite authors of all time. I absolutely love her writing. I just think it's so atmospheric. I love what she does with characters. I love the kind of morality crisis that all of her books contain, that she really captures the nature, human nature, so very well. And most of her characters are almost always morally gray, which makes them so much more realistic and relatable because no one is entirely good or entirely bad. I mean, I love a good hero, but I love a good anti-hero as well. This is about multiple Londons. There are 4 different Londons. There's White London, Grey London, Red London, and Black London. Black London has been completely destroyed and consumed by magic. White London is on the way to being completely destroyed by magic. Red London is absolutely thriving and full of magic. And then we have Grey London, which is basically our world, where no magic exists at all. And we're following Kel, who is a magician who can travel between all of these different Londons. This book contains my favorite character, my favorite female character of all time, which is Delilah Bard. Even though I have read other books, many other books, where I have found characters that I absolutely have fallen in love with, no one holds a candle to Delilah Bard. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's just because she was one of the first female characters that I literally fell in love with, but no one compares to her for me. Like, no one is Delilah Bard. I just love her so much. One day I really need to do like a video of my top characters of all time, but spoiler alert, Delilah Bard is number 1. I feel like the most famous quote, I'm pretty sure if you've heard anything about the Shades of Magic trilogy, you've heard the famous quote, "I'd rather die on an adventure than live standing still." That is a Delilah Bard quote, and it perfectly sums up her personality, who she is, what she's about. And I love that quote so much, and I love her so much, and she is honestly 90% of what makes this book and this series so incredible for me personally. I cannot wait to reread this series. I'm waiting to reread it once we get an announcement for the 4th book. But yeah, if you have not read the Shades of Magic trilogy, I think you should pick it up. I know that V.E. Schwab is not for everyone, that her writing is not for everyone, but she definitely is the author for me. Okay, next we have the Strange the Dreamer duology by Laini Taylor. I'm holding up the second book, which is Muse of Nightmares, mostly because it's just more pretty than the first book in this edition, which is Strange the Dreamer. And I definitely enjoyed Strange the Dreamer more. Strange the Dreamer as a book is in my top 5 books of all time. One of the things that I love the most when it comes to reading is atmospheric, beautiful, lyrical, poetic, purple prose. And Laini Taylor does it so well. Her writing is hypnotic, it's beautiful, it's haunting, and I know that that's something that not everyone enjoys, but it's definitely my favorite thing when it comes to reading. Strange the Dreamer just has so much interesting magic, and it has a character that once again is one of my favorite characters of all time. Laszlo Strange is a librarian who is obsessed with this mythical long-lost city of Weep. No one believes that it's really a thing anymore, but he knows that it is, and he knows that magic is real because he experienced it when he was a little boy. And the original name of the city of Weep was magically taken out of everyone's heads and replaced with the word Weep. He has studied his entire life about this city and finally gets the opportunity one day to travel there. And the story goes from there. I just think that it's such a beautiful book. Like, I knew absolutely nothing about it when I originally picked it up. It was another book that I had an arc of that I wasn't even interested in reading, to be honest. But I picked it up on a whim and completely fell in love. It's one of those books that gives you a glimpse of what the ending is going to be at the beginning, but still when you get to the ending you can't believe that it's actually happening, and it's heartbreaking and it makes you cry. It made me emotional. I love the series so much. Strange the Dreamer, one of my absolute favorites. It had to be in the top 3 series of all time. I love it that much. Coming in at number 2 is the Broken Earth Trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. Listen, N.K. Jemisin is out here writing, creating in a way that I feel no one else does. No one else can do. She is just so unique in her writing style, in her concepts. Her mind is absolutely insanely brilliant. Like, no one else writes the way she does. And I still have not read all of her series yet. The way she plays around with perspective, the twists in here, the scathing social commentary, everything about this is so incredible. I will not ever get this out of my head. I've read the series twice now, and I've read this particular book 3 times now, and I cannot wait for the day that I reread it again. I am so in love with this series, with N.K. Jemisin's mind and writing style. A lot of people find this particular series very confusing and hard to get into, and while yes, I agree that it is somewhat confusing, it's definitely a book that you have to just trust the author to eventually get you there. That's what I did, and I'm so glad that I did because I absolutely adored it. My number 1 favorite series of all time, like I said, is not even a series that is completed yet. And I feel like if you have been on this channel for any length of time, you should already know what this is. I would be very interested to know if you are able to guess before I hold up the book. So feel free to put your guesses down in the comments before I show you the book. But this series just means everything to me. It has everything that I love in fantasy. It's from one of my favorite authors of all time. Have you guessed yet? Have you guessed? It is the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. Yes, there are only 4 books out in this, what is eventually going to be a 10-book series. But I know in my heart of hearts that it is my favorite of all time. It has one of my favorite characters of all time, which is Kaladin. I love him. I love the mental health representation in here. I love the magic. I love the world. Sanderson's world and magic system is so incredibly intricate and detailed, and the world itself, like ecologically, socially, politically, is so incredibly fascinating. Like, I wish that I could just read like a history book or like a textbook on the particulars of this world, and I know I would love it. It's my favorite world ever. It's my favorite magic system ever. I love this series, and it's so difficult to explain. We have this all-encompassing war. We have ancient magic that is awakening. We have an ancient threat that is awakening, and basically the end of the world type scenario. So there's a lot going on in here, and it's very difficult to describe and explain, but it's so fascinating, it's so enjoyable, and it's so well done. It just is. It makes me emotional. There's found family, there's beautiful relationships. It's so intricate and detailed in a way that is anything but dense. It's so easy to read, so easy to get into. It has to be my number 1 series of all time. Highly recommend it. I know that it can be very intimidating. First of all, it's a very long book and a very potentially long series, but it's so worth it in the end. And there you have it. Those are my top 10 favorite series of all time. I hope you enjoyed this video. Talk to me down in the comments. Let me know your favorite series of all time, but also let me know if you have read any of these, if you feel the same way. Always like discussing with you in the comments. But that is going to be it from me today. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!